slama dječjim, rasti i cvijetaj, zemljo ravnih ljudi. I neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada, mir tvojim lađama napuči i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, Tita!
เข้ามาเต็มที่ดินแดนแห่งนี้สู้ตีลังกาเรือน้ำโลได้ท่าแดงตัวแดงมอนเสียสละสู่สนป่าแพร่ไปลีเก็บทอดไว้นี้จะรักษาศักดิ์ศรีเอราสมีไปในทั่วแดนลาว
Trovato, che до самых окраин, с южных гор до северных морей. Человек проходит, как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. Страна моя родная, слава ей, полполей. Я другой такой страны не знаю, но я такой на весь человек. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на весь человек. За столом никто у нас не лишний, по заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, подвиг и на труд. Страна моя родная, слава ей, полполей. Весенний ветер веет, с каждым днем все радостнее жить. И никто на свете не умеет лучше нас смеяться и любить. Но сурово брови мы насупим, если враг захочет нас сломать. Как небесную родину мы любим, бережем, как ласковую мать. Страна моя родная, слава ей, полполей. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на весь человек. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на весь человек.
Greetings, everybody, and welcome. It is the evening of the 30th of May, 2024, and we are coming to you with a live stream tonight, which is covering the interesting reports given recently to the plenum of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation regarding the current situation in Russia and the world situation. And there's some highlights from that which I want to go through with you this evening. Tomorrow we will be back with our regularly advertised programming, which is of course the ongoing series regarding Stalin's collected works entitled On the Opposition, which is covering the debates in the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, as its predecessor organization, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Bolsheviks, and the debates that took place in there that are wrongly boiled down to Stalin versus Trotsky. In actual fact, they are a lot more complex than that, and each man actually is more of a representation of different class forces. And so we'll be doing that tomorrow at the same time. Before we get underway this evening, though, I will do a quick walkthrough of the those who are in the chat so far. So we've got C. Bolt with us, who says, "What an absolute shower this Labour Party are. I'm pretty shocked, to be honest." I'm not. I don't know what you're referring to, but if you're referring to the suspension or deselection of Diane Abbott, I'm not surprised at all. Look, Keir Starmer is a Tony Blair tribute act. That's all he is. He is inspired by the Tony Blair period. He's advised by people from that period, but he's nowhere near as smooth an operator, to quote a song by Sade, and he's nowhere near as good an actor. So everything he does is clunky and clumsy and causes more problems for him than it solves. That and the fact that the Labour Party lost any remaining legitimacy it really had over 20 years ago. Now it only exists because some working class people will continue to hate the Tories a bit more than they hate the Labour Party. There's no positive case to be made for them. So in his attempts to appear strong and determined to smash the left and all that kind of shit, he's created needless problems for himself. with Corbyn and now with Diane Abbott, who's, if they don't back down and let her back into the party, well, if they do that, then he'll look weak, and he'll be desperate not to look weak, even though he does now already. He'll see it as the strong thing to stick to his guns, and then he'll end up losing that seat, which is Hackney in London, to Diane Abbott if she runs as an independent. By the way, I think Abbott's even worse than Corbyn politically. I think the entire Labour left needs to be discarded and exposed ruthlessly for the utter frauds they are and always have been. But the fact that Starmer has allowed the hysteria of the most reactionary sections of the ruling class to guide him down a path of looking incredibly foolish and incredibly weak just says exactly what he is, which is the man is A, not very bright, B, the only thing that really animates him is a desire to impress the most reactionary sections of the ruling class. That's what his entire career has been based on, both as a state prosecutor and now as leader of the Labour Party. He's a spineless reactionary, which makes him quite a dangerous candidate for Prime Minister. I mean, Boris Johnson was a dangerous fool as well, but I think he was a little bit more intelligent. A swine, no doubt, but more intelligent than Starmer. Rishi Sunak's just a nothing. I think the last Prime Minister who had a sort of vaguely functioning brain was probably John Major. I mean, the rest of them have just been no marks, even by the standards of British bourgeois politics. Right, Not a Pacifist is with us, as is Dr. Ahmed, who joins us from Egypt. Alan joins us from Oakland, California, and is looking forward to this topic. Albert makes the correct point that Sir Keir Starmer is just in a line of continuity from Ramsay MacDonald. Nehat Mere asks for a video in the future about Juche, ideology of North Korea. Certainly we can look at that. Arnold joins us from a wet and cold Bridlington, one of the finest places to spend an English summer. Jay joins us from the American Highway Hellscape. Sounds like an album. Almir is with us, as is Ash, joining us from Down Under. Luca says, good evening. Pausing the reading of What is Dialectical Materialism, which Alex posted recently on Telegram. Full credit to that one goes to the Soviet Books channel, who have been posting these translations, these English translations of Soviet texts up on their channel, and I share quite a few of them over onto mine. The work on dialectical materialism produced by the Soviet Party up until the Gorbachev era. So I mean, that one I shared yesterday was published in 85, which means it was probably written about 83, 84. So there are a lot of the Soviet stuff when it comes to dialectical materialism and the Marxist philosophy as in introductions to it. A lot of that stuff is still good up until about 85. Some of it is a bit dubious when it tries to work in whatever twists and turns the Soviet leadership were taking at the time. But the stuff like the dialectical materialism analysis by people like Spirkin, that's all very much worth reading. Carolus Maximus is with us, as is Austin, as is Michael, who is joining us from West Belfast. Morgan is with us. Tim Gray says, a request, can we have more content about early Soviet history? Well, come back tomorrow and you will get your wish fulfilled. Ash says, this program starts as Trump is found guilty. Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to talk too much about that because, well, the Trump thing is a circus. I tell you what, I may have to come back to that at some point tomorrow. I'll think about what to do about that. I mean, the ideal way this year would end is if both Trump and Biden both end up in prison. But the thing about the Trump case is that of all, I mean, that they've charged him with the various things that are largely either, if not completely falsified, then they are trumped up charges, no pun intended. And Biden has, of course, done far worse. They should both be in prison for war crimes, but that's another matter. Abolish NATO said, isn't it a good thing that the ANC lost their majority because now they can form a majority coalition with the EFF? I haven't caught up with this yet. I will be catching up with this tomorrow, so we may have to do an extra long show tomorrow. Let's we'll come back to this one. Eduardo is joining us from the People's Republic of Ealing. Congratulations on having declared independence, comrade. Alex Oliveira joins us from Brazil. TD Mallard is with us. Christopher says, People's Republic of China, greetings. Are you joining us from the PRC, Christopher? Good evening to Otis and Colchester Ian. And we are joined by Rob and Beans from the wrong side of the Pennines. Good evening to you, comrades. Mutanda says, Starmer and Johnson both seem to want World War III, dangerous people. Starmer is an empty vessel. He is filled with whatever the hell the last person in authority told him to say. Johnson is a blowhard and a bullshit merchant and a cynical bastard. Johnson is much more aware of the game than Starmer is. And Johnson's game in Ukraine was always to get the Ukrainians to do the dying. That's still his game. All the amped up rhetoric is just designed to keep the Ukrainians viable and in the field and their leadership in place. Trust me, Boris Johnson does not want to actually be in charge of a war. Boris Johnson can barely be in charge of his own trousers. Hello to Dingo Ate Me Baby from the Banana Republic of America. Steve Choate, hello to you from North Georgia, USA. And Agitate is with us as well. All right, so let's get into this then, which is, of course, the comments made recently, or I should say the speech made recently by Gennady Zyuganov, the leader and general secretary of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. I'm just going to post the translation, which I've put up on the website. I'm going to start doing this more regularly, which is to place speeches and articles from the KPRF, especially, on the website, in order that even if I'm just using machine translations, which aren't always perfect, people can get an idea of what is actually being said by the actual opposition party in Russia, which, of course, is always ignored by the bourgeois press. So this is the speech we're focusing on is Zyuganov's recent speech at the recent plenum of the Central Committee of the KPRF. Now, if you're not familiar with who Gennady Zyuganov is, he was a long-serving official in the Communist Party in the late Brezhnev period and the Gorbachev period. He was initially identified with a pro-reform so-called faction, but he did turn against Gorbachev by about 88 and started denouncing him. He later, after the collapse, goes on to form the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. He is very much a case of the man who would be king, to quote a title from Rudyard Kipling, because he was expected and indeed probably did win the 1996 Russian presidential election. He was cheated out of it by a combination of Russian compradors and intervention from US imperialism. He was so far ahead in the polls before the intervention of those forces that he was even getting somewhat favorable interviews on the old Charlie Rose show on US television, for instance. He even got an English language print of an autobiography that he'd written out into the press in the English speaking world. Now, interestingly enough, because I was checking into this recently, none of his other books have been made available in English, just that one. So there was clear expectation amongst some in the imperialist capitals that he would be the man who would take over from Yeltsin. But this was before a determined campaign waged by the Clinton administration, the CIA, and the domestic comprador bourgeoisie, led by people like Boris Berezovsky in 1996. And even Medvedev, Dmitry Medvedev, has acknowledged that that Boris Yeltsin, easy mistake to make, didn't win that election in 1996. So Zyuganov, interesting figure in many different ways, and the KPRF are frequently criticized by domestic critics from Russia itself for being reformist and for being Brezhnevites and various other criticisms are thrown at them. And I've made some of those criticisms myself. I think certainly it's the case with Zyuganov that he bears the imprint of a late period Brezhnevite official, because that is indeed what he is, something he shares with Putin in actual fact. So the analysis of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, when it comes to the question of Ukraine and how to deal with the Banderist regime that was imposed on Ukraine by the imperialists, and of course the role that Ukraine was being set up to perform, that is an outsourced military encampment of the US imperialists and their allies in Europe that would be designed to carry out attacks on the Russian minority to provoke a crisis in Russia itself. The KPRF have shown themselves to be consistently correct about this point ever since the first crisis, all the way back in 2004 to 5. And they were calling for a special military operation to be launched as early as 2014. Now, of course, there are many different variables here which we could argue about, but there is an argument to be made that had the Russians quickly dealt with this in 2014, that the position that they are in now would be a better one, and that there would be a lot more people who are now dead that would be alive. See, had they gone in 2014, then again, there are different arguments on this, but there is a strong argument to say had they gone in quickly and defended the rebellion in the Donbass and actually stopped the Ukrainian or NATO-sponsored forces from taking places like Slavyansk and Mariupol, then the Banderite regime would probably have collapsed quite quickly. It came pretty close to collapse anyway. Instead of which, of course, the Putin, reflecting, of course, the class basis of his government, sought to do endless deals with the imperialists in the hope of preserving the market share of the Russian energy companies in Europe in particular, and not being subjected to further sanctions. It was only at the last minute, when faced literally with the crushing of the Donbass republics by the NATO-trained and organized Ukrainian fascist-led army, that the Russians launched the special military operation. Only when faced with essentially doom did the Putin system finally get pushed into action. And this is something which is pretty much uncontestable. So the KPRF have been proven to be correct on this point, and they are the major force in opposition to United Russia. And so therefore their analysis is something that we as communists in Britain or the United States or Europe or wherever you're located should be familiar with. And that's the reason why, of course, I've put it on the website. So I'm going to be going through this and talking a little bit about it and taking questions afterwards. So the first part I wanted to quote to you was not really anything about the current situation, but I think it's a very good exposition, shall we say. It's an exposition of the superiority of the Marxist-Leninist worldview. And Zyuganov, quite early on in his speech, says, "Communists have their own view of the course of events. Armed with historical materialism and dialectics, they see the true causes and the hidden mechanisms of the historical process. There are no inexplicable zigzags for them. Followers of Marxism-Leninism do not float at the will of the waves. They do not wander blindly in the darkness of the unknown. They accurately understand the background of the phenomena," which I think is a very good way of explaining or a brief explanation of the superiority of the Marxist-Leninist method, which is that it doesn't leave you with mysteries. You're not baffled by things. You can explain the twists and the turns taken by, shall we say, the actions of the US imperialists and their allies. And that's what enabled the KPRF to clearly understand what the imperialists were up to in Ukraine before the bourgeois government in Russia did. You can argue that maybe Putin himself understood it, but the Putin system always works on trying to gain a consensus. And that consensus has always included, or it did until quite recently, the open comprador elements who were also part of the system. Remember, Anatoly Chubais, an arch comprador, had a admittedly minor role within the Russian political system up until 2022. And so it was clear that Putin's system has always sought to incorporate all these different factions that were fighting each other in the 1990s and to consolidate them together and to create consensus between them before acting. And that's what leads to the glacially slow progress, even when the Russian government starts to go in a more positive direction. So, and also it reminded me recently of a video from our old friend Tucker Carlson, who was babbling away like Alex Jones, a sort of slightly more restrained version of Alex Jones, about how has the Democratic Party done a deal with extraterrestrial or demonic forces? Is that why things are going this way? Or, Russell Brand converting to Catholicism, or others babbling away about Jungian psychoanalysis, like as if it was Jordan Peterson himself around. If you're not equipped with the tools that the scientific socialist analysis can give you, then you will end up babbling about demons. You will end up believing that the characters in charge of the U.S. empire, if you see them as evil, you'll start seeing them as simple, as sort of not human anymore, as either aliens or demons, or you'll start, like liberals do, start tearing your hair out and saying, why are they behaving so irrationally? There's nothing irrational in the way they behave. It's that they are expressing, the imperialists are, the decay of the system. And so if it seems irrational, their behavior, it actually is a reflection of the crisis of the system. But the behavior towards Russia is, of course, not irrational. It is entirely rational that the US ruling class would seek to collapse the current government of the Russian Federation and either replace it with a group of pure compradors, not just a section of compradors, and to be able, or if they couldn't get that, to break up the Russian Federation and loot the country and asset strip it. And that is a product of the crisis of US imperialism that it has been in since at least 2008. We've covered before on this program that you can make a strong argument that crisis has actually been going on a lot longer, but it's at least since 2008. And they also need to, from a strategic point of view, weaken or destroy Russia in order to get a better angle on the Chinese. So the behavior of the US imperialists with regard to their hostility and their war making against Russia actually makes sense from the needs of the point of view of the ruling class of the United States. Now, from our class's point of view, this is a horror, given that it takes us closer to war with a major nuclear armed state, which, of course, it will be us that will be sent off to die horrifically in, not the bourgeoisie themselves. And for us, it makes no sense to have a war with Russia, but for the bourgeoisie, it does. What we need to bring people to an understanding of is that their interests are not ours and never will be. So we move on now. So Zyuganov throws in a good quote from Lenin, which I will read out to you. It says that this is Lenin's comment from the 7th Emergency Congress of the Russian Communist Party Bolsheviks from March of 1918. And he quotes Lenin, who says, Marxists have never forgotten that violence will inevitably accompany the collapse of capitalism on all its scale and the birth of a socialist society. And this violence will be a world historical period, an entire era of the most diverse wars, imperialist wars, civil wars, within the country, the interweaving of both, national wars, the liberation of nationalities crushed by the imperialists, various combinations of imperialist powers. This era is the era of gigantic collapses, massive military, violent decisions, crises. It has begun. We see it clearly. So this is Lenin's accurate forecast of the period that they were then in March of 1918. It's a period we are still in today. We are still in the period of war, imperialist war, wars of national liberation, revolution and counter-revolution. That is the era that we have been in since World War One. And remember, a century is a long time in terms of the lifetime of the average human, but it's not in terms of the grand sweep of history. So he then goes on to talk about the Russian party's view of fascism, which of course draws from the work done by Georgy Dimitrov of the Comintern back in the 1930s, and he explains quite properly that that fascism is and has to be viewed as a form of bourgeois rule, the most extreme form of bourgeois rule, and that the bourgeoisie have, for well, ever since the end of World War II, definitely been trying to obscure this and obfuscate the issue away. So I'll read you this quote as well. For a century now, bourgeois ideologists of various shades have been trying to confuse the issue of fascism and divert attention from the essence of the problem. In the information and educational space of many countries, especially the West, fascism is assessed only as an anomaly and a tragic dislocation. Allegedly, the only issue was the defeat of Germany in the First World War and the humiliating conditions of the Versailles Peace. Ideological jugglers, I'm going to have to use that phrase again myself, explain the persistence of fascism by the machinations of totalitarian regimes. According to their mentality, all illiberal systems are related and alien to democracy. Speculation on analogies between fascism and communism is an important part of the West's propaganda baggage. And that, of course, is something which has been going on for quite some time. And the KPRF have made this point over and over again, that this false equivalence between fascism and communism comes from, of course, the liberal propagandists who are seeking not to attack fascism by making that comparison, but to attack communism by equating those who defeated fascism with fascism, by hiding behind the dreadful screeds of Hannah Arendt from her work entitled Totalitarianism and the ravings of Karl Popper. They seek to basically do this very crude analogy, which said they'll come up with a quote from Mussolini, who said who was on record as saying that fascism is all about the state. Then they'll say communism is all about the state. Therefore, these are statist ideologies. Of course, this is a piece of shallow nonsense that doesn't stand up to any remotely objective analysis. You can see quite clearly that fascism it is an expression of the most extreme form of the rule of the bourgeoisie, and you don't need to go too far to find it out. As Zyuganov chronicles in his contribution here, there is a lot of evidence that Mussolini, Hitler, and Franco were all subject to the generosity of the imperialist powers. The British and the US in particular were heavy investors in Mussolini's career. The British and the French before World War I were backers of Mussolini because he was a pro-war militant who'd come out of the old Italian Socialist Party and therefore was in a prime position to agitate amongst the working class in support of Italian entry into World War I, which is what the British and the French wanted. So particularly the French, paid for Mussolini to go around the country doing this agitation. So he'd been an agent of imperialism since 1914 at least, and then he was paid more after World War I, particularly by the Italian bourgeois and the landlords, to attack striking workers and peasants trying to seize land off the absentee landlords in Italy. So this guy was a tool of imperialism and domestic reaction from the earliest possible stage, as was Hitler, as was Franco later on. Point that Zyuganov is making, which is of course entirely correct, and one that we agree with here, is that the imperialists have always funded fascism, going back to the earliest time that fascism emerged, because it's the form of rule that they like to use when they feel like they need to smash something up. So this is how they're behaving in Ukraine now is how they've always behaved. It's not an anomaly. The British bourgeoisie and the American bourgeoisie were never anti-fascist, never in a million years. As Zyuganov goes on to point out, the British and the Americans immediately employed the services of various fascist officers and intelligence men to not only build up the new state known as the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, which became all of Germany following the counter-revolution in the East in 1989, but also they employed them to directly carry out attacks on the Soviet Union as soon as the war was over, as we've talked about many times here. So this is, again, one of the reasons why I choose to republish this is that I, who regarded myself as somewhat historically literate, I had no idea about the direct attacks on the Soviet Union that were supervised by the British and the American imperialists and enabled by them when they employed the services of the German fascists in their new intelligence networks in Europe, and they employed the services of the Banderites and Bandera himself in Soviet Ukraine. So again, like, the behavior of these people when it came to Ukraine was not new. They are standing in a tradition that goes back, well, really to pre-World War II and the manipulation of the Ukrainian reactionary nationalists by German imperialism. So, just to make a quick point here, a further quick point about fascism, Zyuganov says the following: "We communists will never agree with those who ignore the key fact. Fascism is a creation of big capital and a spokesman for its interests. We are obliged to resolutely expose any attempts to disguise the causes that gave rise to the Nazi evil. According to the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, solidarity on this issue is one of the fundamental conditions for the creation of any alliances and coalitions with the participation of communists." And that's, of course, a reference to the internal Russian domestic situation there. So moving on, he talks quite extensively about the collaboration of US imperialism with the fascist forces of the defeated German Reich. And that point's been made many times, but I think it needs to be made endlessly because very few people in Britain certainly understand those points. People think that the Nazi hierarchy all got hanged after the Nuremberg trials. Nuremberg trials, which, by the way, only happened at the insistence of the Soviet Union. The British and the Americans certainly didn't want to hold those. Because as Churchill and others pointed out at the time, if the German generals were found guilty, then they all could be as well, in knowing full well they were going to be waging, or already were waging, colonial wars to hang on to their imperial possessions, which were conducted in a manner of which, regarding which the Einsatzgruppen would have been proud. So, looking then at the next part of his speech here, he starts talking in quite an interesting fashion about the nature of the bourgeois in Russia, and this is a theme that he will return to in many different parts of the speech. But I'll read you this bit out because he says the following: "Behind the screen of the struggle for the idea of a nation, the pragmatic motives of the national bourgeoisie are often hidden. With the help of nationalism, a number of problems are solved. Firstly, the achievement of greater independence from the old capitalist centres is justified. Secondly, a blow is dealt to the comprador part of its own bourgeois elite, which looks to the West. Thirdly, the protest movement is suppressed. Working people are distracted from the fight for their interests by ideological surrogates about the great future of the nation. Those who nevertheless dared to stand up for the rights of workers are branded as traitors to the national interests. National capital strives for unlimited influence within the country." So, this is a very important point to raise, and it's a point that we have spoken about on this channel before now. If you look at the work of and the analysis of the KPRF, they constantly talk about this, that there has been an evolution in the way that the class struggle has gone in Russia, and that there has been emerging a more coherent national bourgeoisie under the auspices of the Bonapartist regime run by Putin and others. And this national bourgeois is now ready to at least assert itself or defend itself from the impositions of the US imperialists. And so the KPRF has correctly stated that as far as the national bourgeoisie is prepared to actually conduct a fight against imperialism and in defense of the sovereignty and independence of Russia, then that's the fight that the KPRF will and support, and indeed do support. But they make the point there that this national bourgeois is something which is, of course, not to be trusted in the long term. Though it may have evolved beyond being a purely comprador creation, it still can't be relied upon to conduct persistent fights against the imperialists. It's being forced to now. They're being forced to because the imperialists won't concede to them. You look at the negotiations that were being held between the Russians and, nominally at least, the Ukrainians. They came close to a deal, but it was the US imperialists via the messenger boy Boris Johnson who blocked this. And of course, the Russian ruling class, the Russian bourgeois, would have taken that deal because it would have, they hoped, avoided more sanctions and kept the markets of Western Europe open to them. Now, that, in the end, was killed by the imperialists themselves, and it's the imperialists that are radicalizing the situation by keeping on with their push to prop up the Ukrainian leadership to keep the war going. Whereas in actual fact, the Russians would have signed a deal that only took Donbass into the position that Abkhazia and South Ossetia are in Georgia, which is independent in all but name, but still sort of in Ukraine, as it would have been with Donetsk and Lugansk. And of course, Crimea would have been signed over forever. So it was very much a minimal deal that the Russian bourgeois would have favored in March and April of 2022. It was the imperialists who rendered it impossible. So Zyuganov will return to the subject of the national bourgeois later on. Now, he makes an interesting point here about the multipolar world, which I very much agree with, and I want to share with you. Because this quote reads as follows: "The left is called upon to draw important conclusions. The concept of a multipolar world has given rise to the belief that the weakening of the West will automatically lead to a just world order. Yes, the weakening of US imperial claims gives new opportunities to progressive forces, but a just world will not arise on its own. There is a serious fight ahead. Moreover, a multipolar world of warring nationalisms would be fraught with new threats. To build a safe and just world, communists and workers' parties must strengthen themselves, solidarity and loyalty to principles." So, this is a point that I will not cease to make. There is what I view as rather naive belief at best amongst some of what I would call the multipolar theorists, that imperialism, if it loses in Ukraine, which it will in the end, it will cynically prop up Zelensky and the Ukrainian state for as long as it can, and then eventually the plug will get pulled and they'll move over to running a guerrilla war, and there will be hundreds of thousands of more dead by that stage, unless of course the Ukrainian state collapses before then. But there are those who believe that if we can just reach the point where the US ruling class is convinced that it can have its place in this new multipolar system, that the Russians and the Chinese don't want to impinge upon their national interests, that everybody can then reach a new deal with each other, and everything can go to a new world order peacefully and without class struggle almost. Now, this is an understandable point of view, especially for those of what I would call a petty bourgeois disposition. And this is indeed the deal that Mikhail Gorbachev was offering to the US imperialists in 1986 to 87 in his wretched book entitled Perestroika, which we have talked about before. Again, this is a deal which the Russian ruling class wanted to reach after they, of course, were able to stage a treacherous counter-revolution in the Soviet Union and destroy it, which was that if the US is prepared to give the newly emergent Russian national bourgeois, which Putin is the head of, a political head of, and represents, then if the US is prepared to basically concede that the Russian national bourgeois has certain interests and has interests in developing its own industry, developing its own manufacturing base, and of course modernizing the state and the economy to a certain degree, and also has interests in the surrounding countries in terms of building up things like the Eurasian Economic Union, then if those interests are respected, then the Russian national bourgeois has no real interest in challenging the United States in areas which the US imperialists regard as their own, be it Central and Southern America, or Sub-Saharan Africa, or Northern Africa, or the Middle East, or West Asia, as it's more accurately referred to. This was an offer that Gorbachev was making. And of course, the US imperialists have never taken them up on that. This is what Putin's speech in 2007 was all about. It's the emergent national bourgeois in Russia giving a warning to the US saying, we want to do business with you, but you keep essentially pushing for us to remain in the comprador position. And this is unacceptable. And it's unacceptable to them for a number of reasons. Partly it's unacceptable because they have certain interests inside Russia and in the immediate post-Soviet space, which they want to see the US respect. That is business interests, class interests. But also, if the US keeps pushing to, in terms of, keeps pushing the Russian political system to the point of near snapping, if it keeps piling on sanctions, if it keeps trying to essentially overthrow the Russian national bourgeois and elevate the compradors again, then not only is it the case that that's, of course, a danger to the class position and power of the national bourgeois, but also it runs the risk of destabilizing capitalism in Russia entirely and discrediting it. Because, of course, the promise that the national bourgeois has made in Russia is that they will, of course, find their place in the global system, and that the capitalism in Russia will bring about wonderful things for the Russian people, the Russian nation, that the Russian bourgeois likes to go on about now. And of course, if that's not possible, then the entire legitimacy of capitalism in Russia, which has always been a bit shaky amongst the proletariat, certainly, starts to come into question. So they have made multiple appeals to the US to strike a bargain with them. And now they've finally realized that they can't. Now they want to go over into this multipolar system. And they're still saying to the United States, look, we'll conclude our business in Ukraine, and then maybe we can do deals on other things. And this is reflected in those who are what I would call Putin's fanboys, and the people who think that they were just going to go through this peaceful transition to this new world. Now, this is the reason why Zyuganov quoted Lenin earlier on to say this will not happen. The nature of imperialism means that they cannot give up. They can't. Now, I would emphasize at this point that even though they cannot give up their struggle for total domination of the entire world, of the ability to exploit the entire world, they are, of course, constrained in what they can do. There's been no talk from anybody, as far as I know so far in the United States, of bringing back conscription or restoring the draft system in the United States. I don't think either Trump or Biden or any US politician, even in the wilder ends of the Democrat or Republican parties, has mentioned that so far, because, of course, they're still haunted by their catastrophic defeats in Vietnam, and not only that, the military mutinies that were part of that defeat. So for all those reasons, they will be desperate not to reinstitute conscription, and they won't be keen on having a full-on war with the Russian Federation, because at the moment they'd lose it. So this is why, of course, the US imperialists operate in this way. They try constantly to psych out the Russians. They try constantly to stage psyops to make it look as if they're going to do some big escalation. They try to, and will continue to try, to keep propping up the Kiev regime, either led by Zelensky or somebody else, just in the same way that they've tried with the Afghan compradors, with the Vietnamese compradors years before that, to prop them up and keep them fighting, even at the cost of hundreds of thousands and possibly millions of dead and wounded in Ukraine. That's what they're going to try and keep doing. So, but to return to the point Zyuganov is making here, there will be no nice, peaceable transition to a multipolar order. Not only is it going to be the case that US imperialism will have to be defeated multiple times, and then even then you will have to see it be defeated closer to home. So it'll have to see its position and its ability to manipulate and dominate Central and Southern America to be fatally compromised. It will also have to be defeated inside the United States itself, which will be the ultimate fight, led by the US proletariat. As I have said many occasions before, and I'm sure most of you here will agree with this point, that ultimately it'll be the job of the US proletariat itself to bring an end to US imperialism. That will be the only thing that ends it for good. As long as the US capitalist class remains in power, they will continue down the road of imperialism. Yes, they will continue to also try to ruthlessly drive down the living standards of the US working class. Possibly they will revert or go towards some form of Bonapartism or fascism in order to do that. But they will all be in the service of defending themselves and their imperialist abilities to exploit large numbers of people and countries all the way around the world. And so ultimately it will have to be the US proletariat that defeats US imperialism, delivers its final defeat to it, because it's not feasible for any country to invade the US. And I, as a communist, do not desire the collapse of the United States. I mean, what I desire is the US proletariat taking power in the United States and ending US imperialism for good. And I think that's something that the Russian communists would agree with as well. So we are now looking at the next part of this, which is also that I will just say an addendum to what I've just said, which is Zyuganov's point about a multipolar world of warring nationalisms would also be fraught with new threats, which is correct. If you if we go beyond the point where US imperialism is the primary contradiction, we get to new contradictions will emerge. Different forms of bourgeois rule will emerge in different countries, which are not necessarily beholden to US imperialism anymore, but they will, of course, still be run by capitalist classes, many of whom are very, very reactionary and have their own rivalries, have their own interests that they will pursue, be drawn into regional wars, and also be drawn to hyper-exploit the proletariat as well. So the point is, even after US imperialism has faded or even gone, it will still be the case that there will need to be a fight for socialism in all of these countries. The multipolar world is, as Zyuganov correctly identifies, an opportunity for us as communists. It's not the end game by a long shot. So I wanted to read to you now from some points that Zyuganov repeats from the analysis of the KPRF in 2001. They published an analysis, and I really do need to follow up with any Russian comrades who can get more of the KPRF's written material in proper translation form about this. But he quotes the party's analysis of the immediate aftermath of the 2001 collapse of the World Trade Center and the attack on the Pentagon. And the KPRF in 2001 made the following points about what the US imperialists were actually trying to achieve in their wars and occupations of first Afghanistan and then Iraq. So the quote reads as follows: "To achieve the alignment of the world into a pyramid of subordination, at the top will be the United States, next to it will be its allies. At the bottom will be the states of the Third World, Russia, Ukraine, the republics of Transcaucasia, Central Asia, and other post-Soviet countries will also vegetate there. Create a supranational power structure subordinate to the United States, a government that is essentially dictatorial and hostile to billions of people on the planet. Establish control over the world's sources of energy and raw materials. Subjugate the financial system and thereby take control of the entire economy of the planet. Carry out the military defeat of countries trying to defend their nation-state interests. Deal with leaders who oppose American hegemony. Tightly control information flows. Impose your system of values upon the world. Suppress all dissidents under the pretext of classifying them as terrorists. completely block Russia as a force capable of resisting such plans. To do this, including through the military presence of NATO on the territory of former republics of the USSR. And he goes on to say, at the same time, the conclusion was made, imperialist globalization is a struggle for enslavement, division and redistribution of the world and its resources. This is the struggle of united imperialism against the world periphery, the struggle of various imperialist groups among themselves. So it's interesting to read that, because as somebody who was just starting to get politically active 23 years ago almost now, what he outlines there and what the KPRF said was the agenda of the US imperialists in 2001. That's a lot more accurate than all of the Western Marxists diagnosed it as at the time. So what they said was the objective of the US imperialists in 2001 was that they wanted to create a pyramid of subordination with the US at the top, and immediately below that will be its allies, and at the bottom will be the states of the Third World, with Russia, Ukraine, the republics of Transcaucasia, Central Asia, and other post-Soviet states will also vegetate there. So that is what they wanted to achieve. That is what the Wolfowitz memo in 1992 was all about. It's what the Project for the New American Century was all about. It's to remake the world, but with under a global system of governance that is run by the United States. Admittedly, that some of these institutions will appear to be so-called international institutions, like the IMF and World Bank and World Trade Organization are, but they will all be subject to the overpowering influence of the US and its immediate allies, mainly the US, though. So that's why they talk about creating a supranational power structure subordinate to the United States. Well, that's exactly what they were attempting to do in the 90s and into the 2000s, and that program accelerated under the presidency of George W. Bush. So also establishing control of the world's sources of energy and raw materials. That's exactly what the plan involving West Asia was all about, that the US imperialists were pushing with regard to the occupation of Iraq. Defeat countries trying to defend their national interests. Well, that had already been going on in the former Yugoslavia and then Iraq. Tightly control information flows, impose your system of values on the world, suppress all dissidents under the pretext of classifying them as terrorists. Well, that is exactly what has gone on. Tightly controlling information flows. Just look at everything that's happened post-2001. I mean, bear in mind, this was a perspective document that he's quoting from here that was from like late September 2001. But this is exactly what they've done with the internet. As the internet, though, has proved to be rather difficult to control, but their efforts to tightly control the information flow continue. I mean, if you're somebody who only gets these news from the BBC or MSNBC, you're going to be the most misled person in the world. And they do very tightly control the information flow. They're very much aware of the need for them to keep rigid control over the bourgeois press, which they have very much established. Any remote amount of old sort of liberal freedoms in that has long since gone. And of course, reclassifying everybody who carries out any serious act of resistance as a terrorist. And again, this is a trick they've been trying for years, but they've redoubled their efforts on it recently. So, and of course, they correctly identified, the KPRF did, that there was a wish to completely block Russia as a force capable of resisting these plans. And this was something that, of course, caused ultimately the war in Ukraine, because they wished to completely block Russia, keep it in its box as a site of raw resource extraction, and only a site of raw resource extraction. Always remember that John McCain's description of Russia as a gas station run by a dictator wasn't a description of the actually existing Russia. It was a wish that he was expressing. It was a wish that he was expressing that Russia would be and remain the gas station run by the dictator. So this is a very interesting prediction that they made 23 years ago, an analysis they made, the KPRF 23 years ago, and one that has proven to be entirely correct. And of course, then you look at the predictions regarding NATO and the the former Soviet states, and this is something that's again come true. Now, the other point that he's making here comes to the nature of the Russian government itself, and here I will read to you another quote which I think is worth engaging with. So it reads as follows: "Global trends are also manifesting themselves in Russia. We are obliged to take the strengthening of right-wing tendencies in our country very seriously. These are not random incidents or the machinations of individuals, but a deep pattern in the development of capitalism. The interests of the bourgeois class make themselves felt. Firstly, part of Russian capital strives for autonomy from the West and wants to occupy a global niche in the form of its own zone of influence. Secondly, the fear of leftist pro-Soviet sentiments in Russian society is taking its toll. They prevent homegrown capital from establishing a classical system of exploitation in our country and prevent it from completely removing the social gains of the Soviet era. Thirdly, the weakness of the raw materials model of Russian capitalism forces the ruling class to actively maneuver, pursuing a policy of Bonapartism. However, they would like to simplify the situation. They would be happy to replace methods of political manipulation with harsh administrative and police control. We insist, praising the White Army means approving the collusion of its generals with foreign interventionists. To proclaim Ilyin, Shmelev and Solzhenitsyn as teachers of the nation means to justify the forces of national betrayal. All this together means a betrayal of the centuries-old path of our people. The search for the advanced part of Russian society has always been accompanied by a thirst for truth and justice. It is enough to remember these people." And then he goes on to list people like Pushkin, Novikov, Herzen, Ogarev, Belinsky, Chernyshevsky, Petrashevsky, Tyutchev, Turgenev, Nekrasov, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Gorky, Mayakovsky, Bloch, and Yesenin as fine examples of Russian literature and thinking, who should be elevated, rather than people like Ivan Ilyin, because this was a controversy that's raging in Russia at the moment, and I'll return to the Ilyin controversy in just a moment. But the point that he's making there is that as we were discussing earlier, that some of the Russian national bourgeois is trying to carve out its own niche, a niche that the US imperialists actively sought to deny them. Now remember, a lot of the compradors in Russia, they did have their interests in the oil and gas industry, but a lot of them were making their money through media. Like this was where Boris Berezovsky, who was the lead comprador figure for a long time and the favorite of the British, he made a lot of money running TV stations, and certainly he laundered a lot of his ill-gotten gains from the thefts he committed through TV and media operations. So the national bourgeois do have a lot of their interests in oil, gas, and minerals and resource extraction. And so they wanted those industries at least developed. Now, the clash with imperialism comes in the fact that the imperialists didn't even want the resource extraction business in Russia to actually be independent. They wanted it to be entirely dependent upon them, meaning they didn't want the Russian national bourgeois and the Russian state to develop the capability of replacing the parts of the different extraction machineries that used by the oil and gas sector that would need replacing as a matter of routine maintenance. They wanted all those to be produced in the West. They didn't want the Russians to be capable of actually building new oil and gas extraction facilities, building new pipelines without Western assistance. They wanted to keep Russia basically as a almost colonized nation, because what is the agenda of neocolonialism? What is the agenda of imperialism when it comes to the various different countries that are in this subordinated position? It is to use them as sites of resource extraction and to make sure that they don't develop, to make sure that they don't actually develop their own means of production that could come to replace or even rival the the American bourgeois. And this is, of course, is why they've thrown an absolute fit about the Chinese, because the Chinese have developed themselves into a position where they can rival the US. And this is something, of course, they didn't want to happen in Russia. And it's the reason why the Putin system had to become more and more Bonapartist as time went on, and had to adopt a more and more advanced level of state intervention into the economy, because without that, then the Russian economy would have been squashed completely by the imperialists. So because of the fact the imperialists kept pushing, it forced the Russian system to slowly but surely adopt a more planned version of essentially a state capitalist version, which some of them in the Russian bourgeois did favor fairly early on, but they were outmuscled by the compradors in the 90s. So this is an interesting reflection from Zyuganov. There's a lot more to the speech. I think it takes you about 45 minutes to read it. I would encourage everybody to read it in full. And what it made me aware of is the fact that the analysis coming from the Communist Party of the Russian Federation is actually a lot better than what I'd been led to believe in the past. And they do have a properly worked out Marxist-Leninist understanding in the special military operation. Again, they called for it to start 10 years ago. And they, as Zyuganov highlights in his speech, do a lot of work in terms of solidarity with the soldiers on the front line. They do a lot of work for solidarity with Donbass. They've dispatched an awful lot of aid convoys to the people in Donbass who've been under siege for 10 years. They do an awful lot of work supporting soldiers at the front line. There's quite a lot of Communist Party members on the front line, and they're actively acting as cadres and going around and trying to recruit new men who have come into the army. And this, of course, points to a potential transformational process in Russia, which is that the bourgeois in Russia, even though they kept on conscription, didn't want the emergence of a mass army anymore. That's what lay behind the unpopular Russian military reforms of the late 2000s, and they wanted to make the Russian military as small and professionalized as possible, modeling it, of course, on the militaries of Western Europe. This, of course, went down very badly with the Russian military itself and in society more broadly. Again, they were forced away from that model by the remorseless hostility of the imperialists. And now they've been forced into a partial mobilization, partial call-up, but also there has been a hell of a lot of men volunteering to go into the army for reasons of patriotism and also because of superior paying conditions. It has been transformed more into a force that is more truly representative of the Russian nation now. And so, therefore, the Communist Party appears to have identified it correctly as somewhere where they need to be active in supporting the special military operation, because that is objectively, as they correctly state, a positive move to defend Russian sovereignty and independence, but also to uproot and remove fascism from Ukraine and uproot and remove the imperialist presence in Ukraine, all of which are positive objectives. But they are, of course, very active in trying to recruit from this army to bring new people into the KPRF. And I mean, it's a very interesting period that the KPRF is going through. And this is something which I'm going to keep a close eye on in terms of its developments, because as they say, as Zyuganov says in his speech, clearly addressing Putin but not naming him directly, you can't lay claim to the victory of World War II, to all the sacrifice and the glories of that, and proclaim yourself to be the inheritor of that, whilst at the same time elevating people like Ivan Ilyin. Ivan Ilyin was a Russian fascist who was, of course, exiled himself from the Soviet Union, went into exile in Germany, and was a supporter of Hitler. Eventually, he had a falling out with the Nazis and went to Switzerland, but he didn't change his views. He continued to praise the Nazis, continued to call for a fascist system to be recreated in Russia, for the Soviet system to be overthrown, for the working class and peasants to be reduced to the status of slaves. And this was not just him. I mean, he was just a prominent philosopher who was openly saying that. This was the position of the Russian fascist organizations, who weren't just active in Europe, they were active in places like Harbin in northern China, which of course at the time was under the rule of the warlords and Chiang Kai-shek and sometimes the Japanese imperialists ultimately. So there was Russian fascist organizations, not just in Europe, but in China at the time, all of whom supported the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Nazis, many of whom on the European side acted as recruiters for Russian staffed German army units. There were quite a few of them, fascist organizations. There was the one led by Vlasov, who was a defector from the Soviet army, who justifiably was executed after World War II. So there was a number of white generals earlier than that, of course, in the Civil War, who had invited foreign intervention into Russia whilst babbling on and raving on about patriotism. People like Kolchak, Denikin, and others, and Krasnov later on, who all of whom were fascists and compradors and collaborators with imperialism. And these people, as Zyuganov points out, were elevated by Yeltsin and his clique and continue to be elevated by people in the United Russia Party. He also points out in the speech, Zyuganov does, that there's people in the United Russia Party who are now raving on about how much they want to defeat the West, who until very recently were still trying to promote the idea of collaboration with NATO, trying to promote the idea of joint military exercises with NATO, and of course continue to this day to elevate the compradors of the Civil War period and the compradors and fascists of World War II. So Zyuganov is completely right when he says that you, Putin, and United Russia don't get to and can't say that you're both the inheritors of the victory of 1945 and the heirs to Ilyin, Kolchak, Krasnov, Vlasov, Kalidin, and all of the others, going all the way back to the revolutionary period and the period of the Civil War, the white army tradition. So you can't be both. But the thing about United Russia is, because of the nature of the system, they are currently trying to be both. And as Zyuganov argues, you can't claim that victory. You can't claim the victory personified by Yuri Gagarin being the first man in space and all of the other achievements that came even in the revisionist period, whilst at the same time promoting the very ideas that would have destroyed all of that and reduced the Russian proletariat and peasantry back to a state of slavery. So this system that Putin oversees is it is frozen in place by it is a frozen compromise, basically, under a Bonapartist system, which is in a perverse way been strengthened by the absolutely uncompromising hostility of the imperialists. But it is fundamentally a transitional system. And ultimately, it's, as the KPRF and Zyuganov keep pointing out, it'll have to transition to a socialist system in order to actually maximize any gains that come out of the looming defeat of the Ukrainians, but also to be able to properly build or rebuild social progress in Russia. See, even Putin admits that the restoration of capitalism, he doesn't say it like this, but the 90s and afterwards have caused a catastrophic collapse in the birth rate. They've caused like social progress to go backwards. They've caused the emergence of, or the escalation of alcoholism and drug addiction, all things that Putin and the leaders of United Russia say are terrible and they want to clamp down upon. But they still defend the system that creates all of these things. And so this is why I think it's important to study the words of Zyuganov and the works of the KPRF, because it is clear that that party is going to play an important role, no matter what criticisms we have had of it in the past, in the next period to come. That the Putin system is by no means permanent. It is a transitional system, a Bonapartist system frozen in place by a specific set of relations in a specific time. And I'll leave the comments on that one there for now, if you'll just excuse me a moment. quick sneeze there. Okay, so I will now return to comments in the chat. So Albert says, Franco had his own MI5 personal pilot. I would not be surprised at all about that. RVA Klavek says, greetings, comrades, from Robert in working class Detroit. Good to have you with us. Ash says, I was shocked to find out how many Nazis ended up in NATO high positions. I was too. I shouldn't have been surprised, but when you dig into it, it's a hell of a lot, and in very high positions in the US as well. DBL, TH says, hello, and I say hello back. Yu Wan joins us from Phoenix, Arizona. Arnold says, also a former UN Secretary General, was in the SS. Yes, that's Kurt Waldheim you're referring to there. RVA Klavik says, American people have been making me crazy. Thanks to comrades for remaining a beacon of clarity. Well, we aim to provide that, if nothing else. 80 says, people in the US are asleep. It's horrifying seeing how people just keep with their life while everything that's happening. Well, that is a symptom of imperialist societies. Absolute complacency up until the point that things really fall to pieces. Our job is to build where and when we can in preparation for the crisis to come. Ash says, funny how they so brazenly rub these fascists in our face, yet many people are unaware. Maybe that's why they thought they could get away with the Nazi in the Canadian Parliament. Indeed, they've been getting away with it since World War II, so they're just used to... They always put these guys on stage. I mean, there's a picture published recently of Prince Charles, now King Charles, being awarded an honorary degree at a Canadian university, awarded to him, presented to him by a Ukrainian Nazi who was in exile there. So they've always done it. The thing was that they didn't expect Ivan Kachinovsky, the exiled Ukrainian academic, to actually do some research and find out who Yaroslav Hunka is and what he'd done in the war. They didn't expect that, because nobody did back in the day. You could have like a exiled Nazi as a rector of a university in Canada or something, and nobody would say anything. And maybe the Soviets would object, but when their objections disappeared, you could get away with putting these guys on stage and calling them great heroes. Unless we forget that Krista Freeland is from a family of fascists and indeed is a fascist herself. RVA Klavek says, I used to listen to BBC and NPR and think I was the best informed guy in the room. It's a trap many of us have fallen into over the years. Harold says, I thought McCain called Russia a gas station masquerading as a country, to which I had the retort that it is the USA, which is a Ponzi scheme masquerading as a country. Well, that retort could also probably even more so apply to us here in perfidious Albion. Klavik says, capitalists bought a pier in Gaza, got a good deal, labour and materials were a great bargain. Yep, lasted 2 weeks. I've done building work myself, which has lasted longer than that. Harold, with reference to the Russians, says, you cannot sit on passing trains possessing just one butt. Indeed. Mary says, Zyuganov is seriously spot on. I'm glad to hear that there are still Russians who can understand the world. Well, the KPRF are an extensive presence. I mean, it's interesting to take a view in on this, to look at it, because there's a lot of Russians who pop up in our information spaces, shall we say, online, who will tell you that, oh, the KPRF are a joke, Zyuganov's an old fool, etc. Doesn't sound like an old fool to me. I mean, it won't just have been him that wrote that report. It'll be a collective work with the Central Committee, I'm sure. He's the General Secretary, so he delivers it. But it doesn't sound like a fool to me. It sounds like, with regard to this situation, they've understood it very well for 20 years. So a lot of these Russians who pop up in the information space over here tends to be rather ultra-left and tends to be, quite frankly, rather silly, to be honest. Frank asks, does this mean Russia has to go through another violent revolution to restore socialism? Well, not necessarily. I mean, I'm not going to say how socialism comes back to Russia. It's not up to me. But there's a number of the Russian ruling class is vehemently and violently anti-communist. So the question of how socialism comes back to Russia is an open one at the moment. I'm not going to rule anything in or anything out. Michael says, great expose of Putin et al. What about Lavrov? Well, Lavrov serves the same system. He's a career diplomat in the Russian system. Yes, he says things which, because he's opposing imperialism, so he says these many things which are true. Putin says many things which are true. When he talks about the role of the US, he says a lot of things which are completely correct, and we highlight those. But the point, the reason for me emphasizing Zyuganov's recent report is that you need to be aware of exactly what the Russian system is and what it isn't. And what it is, of course, as the Russian communists say, it's a Bonapartist system put in place basically because of a massive crisis of the Russian state and a log jam that the bourgeoisie were in between their national and comprador elements, and that Putin's Bonapartism was the way to address this. And now we have a system with a degree more state control. We have their exposure to the influence of the Chinese system, which is interesting to observe. But again, like, the Chinese system is rooted on and rooted in the changes wrought by the Chinese Revolution. So there are people who think that they can just transpose that onto Russian capitalism, and I don't think you can. So we will have to see where that one goes. So moving then to some further announcements. Tomorrow, what I think I'm going to do is, well, we haven't checked in on the Gaza war, or we've done a little bit on the election this week. I did a broadcast with my comrades Rick and Chris from the Class Consciousness Project about this yesterday. We may have to check in with the election tomorrow, but I want to get the Stalin show done. So what I may do is I may do a 45 minutes to an hour on the election, and then do an hour or more on the work of Stalin. We'll have to see how that works out with my schedule tomorrow. Okay, Dan Kovalik has joined us, and great to have you here, Dan. CJ says, greetings from Richmond, Virginia. This is one of the shows to which I will have to listen to twice. Indeed. Okay, so drawing things to a close for this evening. Thanks to all 257 of you who have joined us so far. The audio for this will be up on Patreon tomorrow. We've had a few problems uploading today. Hopefully get yesterday's and today's up tomorrow morning. So thanks to everybody who's tuned in. I'll be back with you tomorrow at the same time, possibly a little bit earlier. Wait for updates on that one. But until then, thank you for tuning in, and good night.
Stim noi, im remur stremosest, o vent de dorsi lupte, de doine si povest. Dar dacă astăzi facea, i lege și ni scut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. dulci cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput,